Hey everybody, this is Eric Brady with Seattle Sound Home Inspections. Just going over a really common issue that we see during our home inspections. Today I have the hardware from one of our rental properties that we got ready to sell, and I just decided that this needed to be replaced because of the issues we're going to talk about. It was something that I knew about. We did live with it for a certain amount of time as a rental property, but it was high on the list of priorities to get fixed. And we got that done for sale, so the new homeowners can have a good solid panel on their hands. So this is a panel called Federal Pacific Stab-Loc, and this is the internals of the panel. Normally it'd be a metal box around here, and then there's a cover over in this case there's this cover, which is the inner cover, and then there's a door, which in this case hinged from the bottom up, that covered the whole thing. How do you tell if you have a Federal Pacific Stab-Loc panel? Well, typically they're labeled FPE, and they have a little lightning bolt on them. They may say Federal Pacific, and they may just say Stab-Loc. All those are very common things that you can tell. On the inner part of the door, usually there's a sticker on panels, and you can see your brand there. In this case, with Stab-Loc, they typically printed it on the inner cover itself, and you can see that says Stab-Loc, STAB-LOK. So we know we have a Federal Pacific Stab-Loc on our hands. So you can see, first of all, I'm sure you've noticed, it's very rusty. This is the Pacific Northwest, and this was an exterior panel on a Cape Cod style house, which means there was really no overhang, which means this thing was exposed to the weather for probably pushing 60 or 70 years. So a long time. So a lot of weather. So sometimes we see them fairly rusty like this in garages. It's not in and of itself on the cover is not a cause for concern, but it might make you question, okay, what does the inside of this look like? And that's why we take the cover, one of the reasons why we take the cover off and look at your inners of your panel during the inspection. So at first blush here, this is a split bus, so there's no main shut off here. The breaker on this side, you can see these weird wires going around. This shut off feeds everything below. So to shut off everything here, you have to turn all the buttons on top. As long as you have less than 8 switches up above, that's acceptable. It's called the 8 motion rule. Don't ask me why. It's just the way it is. And if you have 9, you're unsafe, and if you're 8, you're fine. So, code, yay. Anyways, other things to notice here, your main electrical comes in from the top and feeds, typically 240 circuits are up here on top, and then you have a main that goes down and feeds the 120s. You can see there's some 120s in here. This is just an old application. I'm sure this has been modified several times. What is the issue with Federal Pacific Stab-Loc? Well, there's another brand that we call during inspections, but this one specifically is understood by the industry to have a bit of a design flaw. Now, I don't say that lightly, and there is some evidence on it, but these have actually not been recalled. There is no like, hey, Federal Pacific, we're recalling these, we're going to replace them for you. I believe the company's out of business or has been absorbed by somebody else, and typically this is what is subject to what I call a industry recall, which is home inspectors and electricians, and pretty much anyone you ask on the internet is going to say, you got a Federal Pacific Stab-Loc, you should replace it. So, should you? Well, that's really a choice for you to make, not me as a home inspector. I'm going to give you all of the information, and then you get to make that decision. I ran this in my rental property for several years. I didn't lose any sleep over it, wasn't worried about it in particular. The breakers themselves tripped a couple of times because I had college students in there overloading things. But generally speaking, the wiring in the house had been at least partially updated, and there was the capacity there. And so I just wasn't that concerned. So let's get into what is the issue with these. Well, at least at first observation here, you can see there is quite a bit of corrosion here. Any brand of panel exposed to the weather that this one was is going to have some corrosion. And this is about as bad as it gets. But yet I still don't see any evidence of overheating. The concern with corrosion is it's going to cause the connection between the breaker and the wire that's coming into it here to have more resistance, therefore heat up. Bad connection, potentially arcing if the corrosion gets advanced enough, and then you could have fire on your hands. Now the box is designed to contain fires. That's why we do connections in boxes, but we don't necessarily want to be relying upon that to keep the house from burning down. So we do call corrosion during home inspections. The main issue here is the Stab-Loc itself. You have this opening here that the breaker gets, well, first of all, the breaker gets put into this little catch on the far side and then rotated around and gets pushed into this kind of squarish rectangular opening and clicks. And that is the electrical connection here. And that feeds wire or electricity to the breaker from the main bus, which is a metal piece that goes through the panel here, feeds it into the breaker, and then the breaker disconnects if it gets too much current. And what it's doing is it's protecting this wire here from overheating. So first thing I notice on these wires, and they've been cut off by the electrician, is there's no evidence on any of these wires here of overheating. Typically when you get overheating, the most common place to see overheating is right here next to the breaker itself. And when that is overheating, the plastic rubberized insulator on the wire starts to melt. That's usually the first sign of overcurrent or issues with the breaker itself. That's not typically an issue with that. We do see that sometimes with Zinscos because the breakers themselves are faulty on those, and I'll do a video on that some other time. The main issue here is concern about this connection down here becoming loose and then having arcing, which is when you have, like, imagine two wires of electricity in it and they're not quite touching and the electricity jumps from wire to wire. You can have overheating in that condition because the electricity is free and it's in the air and it's encountering a lot of resistance, so it loses energy to heat. Anyway, so you could have melted breakers and you could have a fire potentially. So let's take this apart together and see. I've actually not had this apart. On my first take, I actually tried to pull these off here and they were too hard to do, so I have to do it with a screwdriver. I wouldn't, you don't do that when this is in service. This is obviously, not connected to anything, so it's safe for me to handle it however I see fit. But if you're having trouble, removing a breaker, getting a breaker in, you really need to consult a professional, because a lot of these bus bars in a panel are actually still live even when the breakers are off. This is where the electricity comes into the house, especially in older ones where you have a split bus up here. There's always electricity in the panel. We just assume so, even if we think it's off. So anyways, let's take it apart and see what we see. See if we see any evidence that this one, I'll bring you a little closer here, any evidence that this has had some issues. Now, that's the first one I had out, so it came out a little bit easier. So here's the electrical connection. Here's the catch that actually sits on the far side here over this little flange. And then here's the stab, or the knife, if you will. Sometimes they call them blades. And it stabs through the opening. On more modern breaker boxes, you actually see the male part, if you will, is typically on the bus bar. And then the female part, if you will, is actually on the breaker. Does it matter? No, not especially. You can see here that, get it in front of the camera, that this is copper, so that's good. Copper has good conductive heating characteristics, so we like that. No evidence of overheating on the plastic breaker itself. The breaker appears to be in pretty good condition other than a little bit of rust. It's free moving, so that's one. Let's go to the next one. And on the bus bar here, there's no evidence of overheating either. There's a plastic piece here that could melt. The other adjacent breakers could be an issue. So no issues so far. So that's one. Here's the next one. Now, what I notice on there is a little bit more corrosion, and I can see some rust on the bus bar itself. Now, the bus bar appears to be aluminum, so these are copper, and then the bus bar is aluminum. Plenty of modern breaker boxes have aluminum bus bars, so that in and of itself is not necessarily a concern. Okay, let's take this next 120 off. Definitely some corrosion there, but and the side of the breaker, those I guess those are probably pop rivets. But anyways, they're the structural part holding the breaker together. It's 2 sandwich pieces of plastic. They are completely rusted, and that's probably just because they're iron with a zinc coating. So, anyways, no signs of overheating there. More corrosion, but you know, pretty much in line. That's a spider web. Again, this thing was outside, and it might have gotten a little bit worse. I let it set on the side of my house for 6 months while I got around to doing this video. But seems fine. Now, again, we don't do this as part of your home inspection for obvious reasons. We can't be in here monkeying with this. It's just not part of the scope. An electrician could do this and evaluate it. But more than likely, they're just because this brand has a bad rap on the market, they would recommend replacement anyways. I mean, maybe you'll find an electrician who's not gonna, but you never know. Tons of corrosion in there. Oh my goodness. Let me get to focus. Well, anyway, you can see the color. It's very, very corroded. But the connections, the electrical connections on the outside of the breaker appear to be fine. All right, let's go up to the top of the split bus. A little bit of corrosion. Not bad. A little bit of debris in here, but I think that's because the one adjacent to that I was cranking on earlier trying to figure out how to get these out of here. Well, that one's actually wet. There's some water in there. Again, it's been on the side of my house, so probably just because it's been out in the rain. We had some snow recently. Yeah. Seems, I mean, externally seems fine. Now, when there's this much corrosion, you got to wonder what the inside of that breaker looks like, but no indication of overheating. Here's the 240. This one might be a little bit trickier to get out of here. Yeah. Well, let's do the other side. Okay. Whew. So this is doubly fun. This is your, you can see a heavier gauge wire here, stranded aluminum. Stranded aluminum's fine. It's a 40 amp, 240 volt, and so it's 120 plus 120. Connections look fine. I mean, it's wet. This one's a little bit more corroded than this one, but no signs of overheating or melting. Same with the bus bar here, no signs of overheating. Now, this is the first time I have looked in here, so you're learning this as I am, or seeing as I am. Lots of corrosion on the inside of this breaker. But again, a little bit of corrosion, more so on one than the other. The way that's in there, that would be, the corrosion would be on the lower one. So maybe water's dripping down and sitting on the lower one. Don't know, speculation. Let's see if I can get this main bus here off. I'll probably unscrew this. Live television, you can see I haven't had this apart before. There's one. It has become one with the breaker. That could be an issue of itself. The breaker terminal is aluminum, and the wire feeding the lower bus is copper. I'll just crank it out of there like that. No, it's not corroded, it's fine. Probably operator error. I inspect these, I don't handle them. So you electricians out there are probably like, LOL noob. And yeah, you're right. I'm a home inspector. I just write reports. I tap things on a keyboard. I never pretended to be an electrician. All right, come on. exciting. Okay, now that one broke when I pried on it. And that's the one I was prying on earlier, and I noticed that some plastic came off. Pretty normal. I mean, I think anytime you're taking apart a breaker like this, and you know, being as rough as I am, you could have that, especially with older breakers. This is original, obviously, because it does not want to come out of here. Because it's the bus breaker for the 120s below. Okay, there's just one of these stabs that just does not want to come out of here. It makes you wonder, is that because it... Okay. Yeah, the breaker's internally failing. But it looks like it's a plastic brittleness issue. You know, this was coming out and sticking in there. And maybe it was because I stuck my screwdriver in here trying to figure out how to get this thing out of here. Or maybe it was because it's just old and brittle. Whatever. I mean, if this was an issue and this needed to still be in service, this would be a fatal fault. But no overheating that I can tell here. There's nothing melted. It's just brittle. Now, is it brittle because it was overheating? Yeah, probably. A little bit, at least. But, you know, who knows? It never got hot enough to actually melt the plastic and, you know, have anything that would be discernible as arcing or a fault. Just one's a little bit more corroded than the other again. Seems pretty straightforward. Now, it wouldn't be a project with me if I weren't to get bloody knuckles. So this is how much I care about your home inspection and you understanding it. Oh, those 120s come out so much easier. Yeah, these are all fine. So let's take a look at the bus bar together. You can see what I'm talking about here. I don't see any signs of melting or overheating. The only issue here was right here. It was a little brittle. I got some debris there. So, and then the mains obviously are very corroded. But outside mounted for, you know, a lifetime. So, not surprising. Anyway, so that's Federal Pacific Stab-Loc panel. That's what it would take to determine if there had been overheating. But then, of course, with all that prying and loosening and everything, you know, you really wouldn't want to reuse this. So even if you had this evaluated, are you going to want to put these breakers back in? And, you know, by this point, you've basically got the whole thing disassembled. Why not drop a new one in? So that's why these don't get repaired or evaluated further, really, even though home inspectors call for it. By the time you get an electrician out and have them evaluated, you know, you're halfway to a new panel. So anyway, if you need anything in the Seattle area, happy to answer questions. Happy to especially to do your home inspection for you. Or if you know anybody who's buying a house, I'm happy to help them. We do consults as well as home inspections. Home inspections technically have to have a written report. So a lot of people in the industry are doing, in our area, are doing verbal inspections. They're not inspections. They by law, they have to have a report. So we do what we call verbal consultations, which is just in a competitive market. You may need to look at a house, waive your inspection, and those run $275 to $325. I really look at everything in those that I do in a normal home inspection. We just don't slow down to do the documentation, take pictures, you know, take notes, things so that we need to do a report later. So really what you're saving is just all of our report writing and the work associated with that report writing. So if you need one of those, happy to help. And yeah, thanks. Bye.